Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the golden world of domes and calligraphy, of palaces that glittered over the Bosphorus, and armies that once made kings tremble. The story of the Ottoman Empire. 6 centuries of order, culture, and ambition. Doesn't begin with weakness. It begins with triumph. And yet, somewhere between conquest and comfort, the empire made a single fatal mistake that would undo everything it built. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is there right now. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in Istanbul, the heart of an empire that once stretched from the gates of Vienna to the sands of Arabia. The air smells faintly of roasted coffee and sea salt from the Golden Horn. The call to prayer drifts from distant minarets, blending with the echo of footsteps in marble courtyards. It is the 16th century, and the Ottoman Empire is at the height of its power. The Sultan rules from his gilded chambers in Topkapi Palace, surrounded by scholars, engineers, poets, and soldiers. Caravans cross from Damascus and Cairo, ships sail from Alexandria and Algiers, all paying tribute to the crescent standard that flies above them. The empire commands not just land, but the imagination of the world. At this moment, the Ottomans are unmatched. They control the ancient trade routes between East and West. Their armas, disciplined and innovative, have crushed crusaders and conquered Constantinople. The empire's bureaucracy, written in calligraphy as beautiful as it is complex, governs tens of millions with precision. Europe watches with both fear and fascination, translating Ottoman military manuals and copying their architecture. And yet, hidden beneath that perfection, a slow imbalance is forming, invisible to those living in the glitter of victory. The empire that expanded through adaptation is beginning to mistrust change itself. Every sultan still dreams of Suleiman's golden age, but no one seems to notice that the world outside their palace walls is transforming faster than they are. In Venice and Florence, printing presses hum day and night, filling the hands of merchants and students with books. In England and France, new ships explore oceans the Ottomans never bothered to cross. In Central Europe, scientists and philosophers are redrawing the limits of knowledge. But in Istanbul, scholars debate whether translating such texts might offend divine order. The empire begins to protect tradition not as a source of wisdom, but as a barrier. The Ottomans do not fall from arrogance alone. They fall from hesitation. The hesitation to reform, to question, to let ideas travel freely. Their decline is not a single collapse, but a long, slowing heartbeat, stretched across centuries. And somewhere in that long heartbeat lies the fatal mistake. Not a battle lost, not a ruler overthrown, but a choice that stopped the empire's mind from evolving while its borders still grew. Tonight, we follow that story, from the brilliance of the early sultans to the silence of the last caliph's exile. You will see how one of history's most organized empires lost the very thing that had made it great. Its curiosity. The fall of the Ottomans wasn't fate. It was a series of human decisions, and the greatest of them all was the one they didn't make. Now, let's step back to the beginning. When the empire was still young, confident, and unstoppable, you stand inside the Topkapi Palace, surrounded by tiled corridors of blue and gold. Courtiers move silently across marble floors, carrying scrolls stamped with the seal of the Sultan. Outside the gates, the city of Constantinople hums with trade caravans, galleons, and the rhythmic hammering of artisans. It is the middle of the 16th century, the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, and the Ottoman Empire is at its absolute peak. At this time, the empire covers over 5 million square kilometers, more than all of Western Europe combined. It stretches from Hungary to Yemen, from Algiers to the Persian Gulf. Its borders touch nearly every major civilization of the era. The Habsburgs to the west, the Safavids to the east, and the Mughals far beyond the desert routes of Arabia. The Ottoman army is unmatched. The Janissaries, elite infantry soldiers recruited through the Devshirme system, form the backbone of its military strength. They are disciplined, professional, and loyal only to the Sultan. Their muskets and cannons, refined through centuries of experience, make them one of the first standing armies in the world. When they march, Europe listens. In 1529, their siege engines reach the gates of Vienna, the symbolic center of Christian Europe. Even though the city holds, the message is clear. The Ottomans have reached the edge of the known world. No empire has ever ruled such a vast and interconnected territory with this level of administrative precision. That precision is what holds the empire together. The Ottoman bureaucracy, shaped by scholars of law and religion, is built around efficiency and hierarchy. The Divan, or Imperial Council, meets regularly to oversee everything from taxes to trade routes. Local governors, known as beys and pashas, report directly to the capital, ensuring that the Sultan's authority reaches from the Balkans to Arabia. Even more impressive is the legal system. The Kunan civil law works alongside Sharia to regulate daily life. Together, they form one of the earliest examples of a dual legal system. A merchant from Cairo, a farmer from Bosnia, and a scholar from Aleppo all recognize the same laws and the same justice. This unity of governance is what allows the Ottomans to rule such a diverse population of Turks, Arabs, Greeks, Armenians, Jews, and Slavs. Culturally, the empire becomes a world superpower of art and architecture. The skyline of Constantinople transforms with the works of Mimar, the master architect whose designs blend function, faith, and beauty. He builds hundreds of mosques, bridges, and aqueducts, the most famous being the Suleimani Mosque, whose dome rivals that of Hagia Sophia. Ottoman calligraphy reaches new artistic heights, turning writing itself into visual devotion. Trade flows through every corridor of the empire. The Silk Road and spice routes still pass through Ottoman lands, and every caravan pays a tax to the Sultan. Spices from India, silk from China, coffee from Yemen, and furs from the north all pass through Istanbul. The city becomes the beating heart of global commerce, the link between East and West. European travelers describe the capital with a Venetian ambassadors write home about bustling markets, libraries filled with manuscripts, and a court where even the smallest decision feels orchestrated. The Ottoman Empire at this stage represents a balance of power, wealth, and culture that few civilizations ever achieve. Education thrives as well. Madrasas schools teach mathematics, astronomy, literature, and theology. Scholars debate Aristotle and Avicenna under domed ceilings, lined with Quranic verses. The empire prizes knowledge, but only within limits, the interpretation of existing wisdom, not the pursuit of new, disruptive ideas. That subtle distinction will one day prove critical. For now, the empire feels eternal. The Sultan's word carries across deserts and seas. Each new province adds not just land, but identity. Turkish, Arab, Kurdish, Greek, Albanian, Persian. Diversity becomes strength. People of many tongues serve under one symbol, the Tagra, the elegant monogram of the Sultan's authority. Even foreign enemies respect Ottoman order. European kings send envoys to negotiate peace, trade, and marriages. When they describe the Ottomans, they call them terribly in war. Just in peace on their Suleiman reforms flourish. He modernizes taxation, establishes public works, and revises laws to prevent corruption. His wife, Hurrem Sultan, becomes one of the most influential women in Ottoman history. Breaking the precedent of secluded royal consorts, the empire's court, once remote, now pulses with intrigue, diplomacy, and intellectual energy. The Ottoman navy dominates the Mediterranean, led by admirals like Barbarossa, Herod and Put, whose fleets control sea lanes from Tunis to Crete. When the empire looks west, it sees a fragmented Europe, small kingdoms, religious wars, and scattered armies. No one doubts which side has the future. Yet, Ibn Ere, in its most confident century, small cracks begin to appear. Military victories become expected, not earned. Scholars favor repetition over innovation. Printing presses, already spreading through Europe, are viewed in Istanbul with suspicion. The empire believes that wisdom must come through scribes, not machines. It does not yet decline, just hesitation. But history is already moving faster than tradition can follow. For now, though the Ottoman Empire stands tall, a civilization of laws and marble, power and poetry. Its cities glitter, its borders stretch endlessly, and its people live within one of the most organized systems ever created. No one imagines that within a few centuries, this world power will fade undone, not by foreign invasion, but by its own fear of change. The Ottoman Empire did not survive for 6 centuries by chance. It lasted because of precision, an intricate machine of soldiers, scribes, scholars, and servants that functioned like clockwork. Each part knew its place, and each duty connected to the next. This system, built during centuries of conquest and consolidation, gave the empire its strength long after its armies stopped expanding. At the heart of it all stood the Sultan, regarded as both political ruler and protector of the faith. His power was vast, but it was not arbitrary. He sat at the top of an organized hierarchy, an empire that could function even in his absence. The Ottoman idea of government was not built around charisma or birthright alone. It was built on administration. The empire was divided into provinces, each ruled by a governor or beylerbey, who reported directly to the central authority. Beneath them were smaller districts overseen by sanjak beys and local magistrates. Every appointment required approval from the capital. This strict vertical chain ensured loyalty and information. Even the most distant provinces sent regular reports to Istanbul, often written in elegant Ottoman Turkish, stamped with personal seals. At the palace, this information flowed through the divan, or imperial council. The divan met several times a week in Topkapi Palace. The Grand Vizier presided, flanked by senior ministers of finance, justice, and foreign affairs. In earlier centuries, the Sultan himself sometimes attended behind a gilded lattice screen, silently listening to the discussions. Decisions reached the empire's edge within weeks, carried by relay riders along an extensive network of post stations known as men. This bureaucracy was supported by a corps of scribes, professional record keepers trained from childhood in handwriting, accounting, and state law. They filled endless registers known as defters, recording taxes, populations, land grants, and military obligations. These defters became the empire's memory. Centuries of ink, detailing who owned what, who owed what, and who had the right to collect it. The efficiency of this system astonished foreign observers. Venetian diplomats in the 16th century noted that the Ottoman state writes more than it fights. Indeed, in an age before modern communication, it managed to keep unified control over millions of people. At the foundation of this order stood the devshirm system, the practice of recruiting Christian boys from the Balkans, converting them to Islam, and training them for service in the empire. It was controversial but effective. The most talented became statesmen, scholars, or janissaries, the elite soldiers who guarded the Sultan and led his armies. Many of the empire's greatest leaders, including grand viziers and generals, came from this system. Their loyalty belonged entirely to the throne, not to local tribes or families. The janissaries themselves were unique in world history. They lived under strict discipline, banned from marriage during service, trained constantly in warfare, music, and ceremony. Their uniform, tall white felt, caps, and long blue coats, became a symbol of Ottoman order. They were the empire's professional army long before Europe developed standing forces. In battle, their discipline and early adoption of gunpowder made them nearly unbeatable. Alongside the military and administration stood the empire's third pillar, religious law, guided by the ulama scholars and jurists who interpreted Islamic law and ethics. The empire's legal system combined Sharia divine law with Ottoman imperial decree. This blend allowed flexibility. The Sultan could legislate on matters of taxation, trade, and land, while religion governed morality and family life. Together, they maintained both obedience and legitimacy. Education was woven into this structure. The Ottomans built thousands of madrases, or schools, often attached to mosques. They trained not only clerics, but also administrators, judges, and physicians. Every city of importance from Edirne to Aleppo had its own network of scholars. The educated class formed a bridge between the Sultan's court and the daily lives of ordinary people. Economically, the system revolved around land. The timur system granted plots of farmland to cavalry officers, who in return collected taxes and provided military service. This arrangement tied the rural economy directly to the army, ensuring both stability and loyalty. The timmerholder was not a landowner, but a caretaker of imperial property. Everything ultimately belonged to the Sultan. The empire also controlled trade with precision. Customs officials monitored caravans and ships, taxing goods as they moved across provinces. Gold from Sudan, silk from Persia, and coffee from Yemen. All passed through Ottoman checkpoints. Major cities, Istanbul, Damascus, Cairo, and Bursa, became commercial hubs. Linking 3 continents, the secret of Ottoman endurance lay in this balance. Power was distributed but never divided. The Sultan reigned as the symbol of divine authority. The viziers managed the machinery of government. The soldiers enforced order, and the scholars maintained spiritual legitimacy. Every class served the system and benefited from it. For centuries, this machinery ran smoothly. Even succession, crises, assassinations, or rebellions rarely broke it for long. When one sultan fell, another stepped into a machine that kept turning. The empire survived weak rulers not because they were rare, but because the system compensated for them. Yet every machine wears down. Over time, positions once filled by merit became hereditary. Bureaucrats grew cautious, soldiers privileged, and scholars rigid. The same hierarchy that had brought stability began to resist change. The empire's greatest strength, its order, slowly became its greatest weakness. Still, in this period of perfection, no one could see it coming. The Ottomans believed they had built a system as permanent as the laws of nature. The empire functioned like a body, disciplined, rational, and united under one will. But somewhere deep inside this machine, the pulse of progress had already begun to slow. At its ID, the Ottoman Empire looked eternal, disciplined armies, efficient bureaucracy, loyal subjects, and wealth flowing through every border. Yet history rarely ends in triumph. What no one inside Topkapi Palace could see was that the same system that had built their greatness was slowly freezing it in place. After centuries of victories, the empire began to lose the one trait that had made it powerful: adaptability. The early Ottomans had borrowed freely from Persians in administration, Arabs in law, Byzantines in engineering, and even Europeans in weaponry. They were pragmatic conquerors, learning from every culture they absorbed. But as power solidified, pragmatism turned into pride. Success made imitation feel unnecessary. Ibn Samiful. Inside the court, conservatism began to outweigh curiosity. The empire's scholars, once open to debate and discovery, increasingly guarded tradition as sacred truth. The printing press, telescopes, and new sciences emerging in Europe were dismissed as distractions, or even threats. The Ottomans, confident in their divine order, saw innovation not as progress but as potential heresy. The ulama, the religious and legal scholars who advised the Sultan, began to see foreign knowledge as a challenge to faith. Theological education emphasized memorization over experiment, commentary over discovery. Scholars debated metaphysics while European scientists built laboratories. The intellectual centers of the empire, like Cairo and Istanbul, remained vibrant in art and literature but stopped producing new, technical or philosophical breakthroughs. Meanwhile, the empire's wealth started to depend too heavily on what it already had: taxes, tribute, and old trade routes. When those routes began to shift, the system showed its fragility. European explorers, beginning with Portugal and Spain, opened new sea paths around Africa and across the Atlantic, bypassing the Ottoman-controlled Silk Road. Goods that once poured through Damascus and Alexandria now flowed directly from India to Lisbon and Amsterdam. For centuries, the Ottomans had profited from being the crossroads between East and West. But when Europe found a way around them, that advantage evaporated almost overnight. Caravans still crossed the deserts, but fewer ships docked in their ports, and the empire's revenues began to shrink. The response from the palace was slow. Reform required questioning the old order, and questioning the old order risked accusations of blasphemy or betrayal. The bureaucracy that once made the empire efficient now made it rigid. Every decision required layers of approval. Every innovation met hesitation. In the army, the same pattern appeared. The Janissaries, once the empire's most disciplined soldiers, had grown powerful and complacent. By the 17th century, many no longer trained seriously. Some bought their positions instead of earning them. They opposed new weapons and tactics, claiming muskets and cannons were foreign tricks. Reformers who tried to modernize the army faced rebellion. The Ottoman economy suffered from similar inertia. The timur system, which had tied military service to land revenue, began to collapse as global trade changed. Local officials, sensing imperial weakness, often turned their positions into hereditary fiefs. Corruption crept into provincial administration. Bribes replaced merit. Favoritism replaced discipline. Despite these cracks, everyday life in the empire remained stable. Markets were busy, mosques full, and the sultans continued to rule with ceremony and splendor. To most citizens, little seemed wrong. But beneath the surface, the empire's foundation was shifting. By the 17th century, Europe had entered a scientific and commercial revolution. New machines, printing presses, and universities transformed societies from Spain to Sweden. The Ottomans, still relying on the traditions of their golden age, failed to recognize that the world's center of innovation had moved elsewhere. Even small symbols revealed this change. In Istanbul, calligraphers still spent weeks copying a single manuscript by hand, a work of art, but slow and expensive. In Europe, printing presses could produce hundreds of books in a day, spreading new ideas across continents. Knowledge was becoming democratic, while Ottoman learning remained confined to scholars and clerics. Still, the empire's strength endured through habit and inertia. Its population was vast, its land fertile, its cities wealthy. The state could absorb failure for centuries before collapse became visible. But history's current had already shifted direction. Every empire faces a moment when it must choose between tradition and transformation. For the Ottomans, that moment passed quietly. No battles, no revolts, just a steady refusal to adapt. The empire that had once absorbed ideas from 3 civilizations began to seal itself off from the world. From that slow closing of the mind came the first whispers of decline. Not in the streets or on the battlefields, but in the schools, the workshops, and the silence of unprinted books. If one single decision could symbolize the Ottoman Empire's turning away from progress, it was the ban on the printing press. In an age when Europe's ideas were spreading faster than ships could sail, the Ottomans decided that printing in Arabic script was too dangerous, too disruptive to be allowed. That hesitation, born from fear rather than weakness, became one of the empire's quietest yet most devastating mistakes. When Johannes Gutenberg introduced movable type in the mid-15th century, the technology transformed Europe. Within decades, millions of books and pamphlets circulated, scientific treatises, navigation charts, political arguments, and translations of ancient texts. Knowledge became reproducible, permanent, and public. It democratized learning. At first, the Ottoman world noticed. European merchants brought printed Bibles, maps, and diagrams to the ports of Istanbul, Izmir, and Alexandria. Scholars examined them, curious but cautious. In theory, nothing stopped the empire from adopting the press. Its craftsmen were skilled, its paper industry thriving, its cities full of readers. But in practice, religious and political concerns closed the door before it ever opened. The Arabic script, complex and ornate, was considered sacred because of its connection to the Quran. The idea of mechanical printing of metal pressing words instead of human hands writing them was seen by many scholars as impure, even disrespectful. Calligraphy in the Islamic world was not merely writing, it was art, devotion, and spiritual discipline. A printed page, uniform and soulless, seemed unworthy of divine text. By the late 15th century, Sultan Bayezid II formally banned the use of printing presses in Arabic, Persian, or Turkish. The decree was not total. Non-Muslim communities, such as Jews and Armenians, were allowed to print in their own languages. The first Hebrew press in Istanbul opened in 1493, followed by Greek and Armenian presses. But for the Muslim majority, printing remained forbidden. The empire thus created a divide within its own intellectual life. minority communities advanced technologically. While the dominant culture remained bound to pen and parchment, the consequences were subtle at first. Manuscripts continued to circulate among the educated elite. Libraries grew, scholars wrote, and scribes made a living. Yet production was slow. A single manuscript could take months to copy. Errors multiplied. Knowledge remained confined to small circles, while Europe raced ahead. By the 17th century, this gap had become impossible to ignore. European nations printed maps with updated coastlines, astronomical tables predicting eclipses, and scientific journals recording experiments. The Ottomans, meanwhile, relied on outdated geographic charts and hand-copied translations of older works. Their navigators, administrators, and physicians had access to far less information than their Western counterparts. It wasn't ignorance, it was structure. The empire's bureaucracy valued control over creativity. Printing threatened both. Books could spread ideas beyond official oversight, challenge interpretations of religion or law, and give common people access to debates once reserved for scholars. Too many in power, that seemed more dangerous than any foreign army. A few brave reformers tried to challenge this system. Among them was Ibrahim Mutafarika, a Hungarian convert to Islam and former diplomat who believed that printing was essential for survival. In 1727, after years of persuasion, he convinced Sultan Ahmed III and the Grand Vizier to grant him permission to open a press, but with restrictions. He could print only secular works, dictionaries, histories, maps, and science texts. Religious materials remained off limits. Mutafarika's press produced 17 books over 15 years. Remarkable works of geography, astronomy, and history. But they've reached only a small audience. Scribes, fearful for their livelihoods, spread rumors that printed books were cursed or inferior. Many refused to copy printed works into libraries. When Mutafarika died, his press fell silent. Europe, by then, had printed tens of millions of volumes. The Ottomans had printed fewer than 20. This technological gap was not just about machines. It reshaped the balance of power. In Europe, literacy soared. In the empire, it stagnated. A literate middle class emerged in France and England, capable of challenging authority with pamphlets and newspapers. In Istanbul, reading remained an elite privilege. Ideas like reform, citizenship, and scientific method circulated freely in Parisian cafes, but not in Ottoman madrasis. Even as late as the 19th century, the difference was visible. When Napoleon invaded Egypt in 1798, his troops brought a printing press with them. The Ottomans, who ruled the region for centuries, had never done so. The French used it to print proclamations in Arabic. An ironic demonstration of how technology, not just armies, could conquer minds. By the time the Ottomans fully embraced printing in the 1800s, Europe was already deep into the Industrial Revolution. Steam engines, railways, and telegraphs had replaced the horse and scroll. The empire was catching up to a world that had long since moved ahead. In hindsight, the ban on printing seems unthinkable, a small rule that caused enormous delay. But to the men who made it, the decision seemed prudent, even protective. They were guarding faith, craft, and order. They who didn't realized that by guarding them too tightly, they were suffocating their future. Empires rarely fall from violence alone. Most fall from resistance to change. The printing ban was not a single act of tyranny. It was a symptom, a fear that modernity might unravel everything that gave the empire meaning. In trying to protect their civilization, the Ottomans slowed its heartbeat. Knowledge, once chained by law and caution, would take centuries to recover its freedom. At the height of Ottoman power, the Janissaries were the envy of the world. They were the empire's elite, trained from childhood, disciplined, loyal, and efficient soldiers who marched in perfect unison and fought without fear. For centuries, they had been the sharp edge of the Sultan's will, from the conquest of Constantinople to the sieges of Vienna. Yet over time, this once loyal course turned into a force that no Sultan could control. A military class that strong-led reform and helped seal the empire's fate. The Janissary Corps was born out of practicality. The early Ottomans, expanding into Christian lands, needed soldiers who were loyal only to the Sultan, not to tribes or noble families. Tosol Betis, they created the Devshirme system, a levy on Christian villages, where boys aged 8 to 14 were taken, converted to Islam, and trained in the palace schools. It was a harsh system, but it produced remarkable results. These boys became administrators, scholars, and above all, warriors molded entirely by the empire. A Janissary's life was one of constant discipline. They could not marry during service, could not own property, and could not engage in trade. Their salaries came directly from the state. They lived in barracks, trained daily, and moved as one unit, the embodiment of Ottoman order. Their music, played on kettle drums and long trumpets, became synonymous with fear in Europe. When that sound echoed across a battlefield, enemies often fled before the fight began. For centuries, the system worked. Janissaries were rewarded with honor, steady pay, and social status. They formed the backbone of the empire's expansion under Mehmed II, Selim I, and Suleiman the Magnificent. Their loyalty allowed the empire to suppress rebellions, conquer cities, and maintain order across 3 continents. But as the empire matured, success began to corrupt the very system that had created it. By the 17th century, the Janissary Corps had grown too large and too powerful. The strict rules that had kept them pure were gradually abandoned. Marriage bans were lifted. Civilian trades were allowed. Sons of Janissaries began to inherit positions meant only for recruits from the Devshirme. The corps, once built on discipline and sacrifice, became a privileged class. They began to see themselves not as servants of the Sultan, but as a political force. They interfered in court affairs, demanded bonuses, and even overthrew rulers. Between the 17th and 19th centuries, Janissary revolts became almost routine. Several sultans, including Osman II, Ibrahim I, and Selim III, were murdered or deposed by their own soldiers. The Janissary's resistance to change was especially fatal in an age of transformation. Across Europe, armies were modernizing with new formations, artillery, and tactics. The Ottomans still relied on a cause that viewed innovation as an insult to tradition. When reform-minded rulers attempted to introduce European drills or uniforms, the Janissaries called it blasphemy. Sultan Selim II, who reigned from 1789 to 1807, understood how outdated the army had become. He founded a new force, the Nizam-i-Sedid New Order, trained by foreign officers, equipped with modern muskets, and paid directly from the treasury. But the Janissaries saw this as a direct threat to their privileges. They revolted, stormed the palace, and forced Selim to abdicate. He was later murdered in his cell. The empire's hope for early military reform died with him. The same pattern repeated under his successors. Every attempt at modernization was met with mutiny. By the early 19th century, the Janissaries were no longer elite soldiers at all. Many rarely trained or fought. Some worked as shopkeepers, musicians, or moneylenders, using their military status for personal profit. They refused to adopt new weapons, even as European armies perfected rifles and artillery. Foreign observers noticed the decline. British and French envoys described the Janissaries as soldiers who carry muskets, but fear to fire them. The empire's armies suffered defeats against Russia and Austria not because of courage, but because of stagnation. The breaking point came during the reign of Mahmud II. Patient and calculating, he understood that reform was impossible as long as the Janissaries existed. In 1826, he took the most drastic step in Ottoman history, an event later called the Auspicious Incident. Mahmud announced the creation of a new European-style army. As expected, the Janissaries revolted. They gathered in their barracks in Istanbul, shouting for the Sultan's overthrow. But this time Mahmud was ready. He declared them rebels and ordered loyal troops and artillery to surround the barracks. Cannon fire reduced the buildings to rubble. Thousands were killed, and the corps was permanently abolished. The destruction of the Janissaries ended a tradition that had lasted nearly 400 years. It allowed Mahmud II to rebuild the military and centralize power, but the cost was immense. The empire had lost both its oldest institution and its sense of continuity. The loyal army that had once made the empire great had become its executioner. The Janissary story mirrors the empire's own rise and fall. Born from innovation, undone by rigidity. They were the perfect symbol of what happens when power resists renewal. Their songs once announced victory across continents. Now they survive only as echoes in military bands. In the ruins of their barracks, the Ottomans learned a lesson too late. No institution, no matter how glorious, can outlive its willingness to change. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire had controlled the most profitable geographies on Earth. The crossroads of East and West. Every caravan that moved silk from Persia, spices from India, or coffee from Yemen paid tribute somewhere under the Sultan's banner. Istanbul, Cairo, and Aleppo thrived not only on culture and administration but on the constant movement of goods. The empire's wealth was not built on industry but on location. As long as merchants had to cross Ottoman lands to reach Europe, the empire's coffers would never run dry. But geography can betray those who depend on it too much. In the late 15th century, a handful of daring European sailors began to redraw the world map. When Vasco da Gama reached India by sailing around Africa, the Ottoman chokehold on trade routes was broken. The discovery of new maritime passages, first by Portugal and Spain, then by the Dutch and English, marked the beginning of the empire's quiet financial suffocation. The change was gradual but relentless. Until the 1500s, every ounce of spice, every bale of silk passed through Ottoman markets. The empire taxed it all, earning massive profits without producing anything itself. But after da Gama's voyage, European ships began sailing directly from Asian ports to Lisbon, Amsterdam, and London. The old caravan trails through Damascus, Baghdad, and Cairo started to empty. The consequences were enormous. The Ottoman state had built its fiscal system around controlling trade. Without that income, deficits widened. Provincial governors demanded higher taxes from peasants to compensate, while merchants turned to smuggling and bribery. Wealth still flowed through the empire, but it was no longer reliable. Meanwhile, the European world was transforming. Access to new resources from the Americas, gold, silver, and sugar, and the profits from maritime trade made Western nations richer than ever. The Ottoman Empire, still powerful, but now cut off from this global shift, began to lag behind. Its economy remained land-based, dependent on agriculture and internal markets, while Europe moved toward banking, manufacturing, and overseas commerce. This economic shift also transformed technology and warfare. With new wealth, European powers invested in shipbuilding, artillery, and exploration. Their maps grew more accurate, their weapons deadlier, their merchants more ambitious. The Ottomans, by contrast, saw no need to compete. They still viewed themselves as the world's center. Their fleets, once dominant in the Mediterranean, failed to adapt to oceanic navigation. The empire's admirals measured success in control of seas they already ruled, not in discovering new ones. The empire's leadership understood trade in terms of caravans, tariffs, and borders, a model that had served them for centuries. But the new economy of the world no longer depended on land. It depended on oceans. The empire, built for overland control, simply wasn't designed for that world. When the Ottomans finally noticed what was happening, they tried to adapt. But too late. In the 16th and 17th centuries, sultans like Selim II and Murad III sent fleets into the Indian Ocean to challenge Portuguese dominance. They established bases in Yemen, Aden, and parts of East Africa. Yet these efforts never matched the scale of European maritime empires. The Ottomans lacked shipyards capable of producing large ocean-going vessels, and they struggled to protect long supply lines stretching thousands of kilometers from Istanbul. By the 1600s, Europe had fully taken over global trade. The Ottoman Empire's ports still thrived regionally, but the economic tide had turned. Ivan Kofi. Once an Ottoman monopoly began arriving in Europe directly from colonies, rather than from Yemen through Ottoman merchants. The shift wasn't only about money, it was about information. As European explorers charted new lands, their discoveries filled printed books, maps, and this knowledge spread rapidly across Europe, creating a culture of curiosity and invention. In the Ottoman Empire, where printing was still restricted, such information circulated slowly, if at all. The empire's view of the world remained centered on old roots that no longer mattered. As Europe's ships carried wealth around the globe, Ottoman galleys remained confined to the Mediterranean. Even the once proud navy of Barbarossa, which had dominated for a century, began to fade into ceremonial importance. Naval defeats such as the loss at Lepanto in 1571 symbolized this shift of power from land to sea. The economic consequences rippled through society. Inflation, driven by the influx of silver from the Americas into Europe, destabilized Ottoman currency. Prices rose faster than taxes could adjust. Soldiers and civil servants, paid in fixed stipends, saw their real income shrink. The empire's treasury was increasingly dependent on short-term loans and confiscations. By the 18th century, European manufactured goods, textiles, tools, weapons were flooding Ottoman markets, often cheaper and higher in quality than local products. Artisans and guilds, once proud symbols of urban economy, began to decline. Istanbul's bazaars were still crowded, but much of what they sold came from outside the empire. This was the empire's slow bleed. Not a dramatic fall, but a steady erosion. The Ottomans had not lost a war. They had lost their economic foundation. Their land still stretched across continents, but the wealth that once flowed through it now bypassed them entirely. The empire tried to compensate by tightening control over what remained, taxing peasants harder, monopolizing salt and tobacco, and squeezing trade within its borders. But these measures only weakened the countryside and increased resentment. What had once been a vibrant, adaptive system became rigid, defensive, and inward-looking. In a world that was becoming global, the Ottomans remained regional. They still imagined themselves the center, long after the map had shifted. By the time the first steamships crossed the Mediterranean in the 19th century, the empire that had once taxed the world's wealthiest routes was reduced to watching foreign ships sail past its shores. Ships it no longer owned on seas, it no longer ruled. By the dawn of the 18th century, Europe was not only sailing new seas, it was reinventing how civilization itself functioned. Steam, steel, and science were replacing the muscle, grain, and wind that had driven the old world. Cities in Britain and France filled with smoke and machines. Human labor was being multiplied 100-fold. The Industrial Revolution had begun, and the Ottoman Empire, once the center of progress, stood almost completely outside of it. This wasn't because the Ottomans were incapable of innovation. They had engineers, mathematicians, and artisans of remarkable skill. The empire built grand mosques with complex domes, aqueducts that defied age, and medical schools that taught anatomy centuries before much of Europe dared to. But the difference lay in mindset. Europe began to see invention as destiny. The Ottomans saw it as disruption. Industrialization required three things the empire resisted: scientific experimentation, private investment, and mass production. The Ottoman economy was still organized around guilds, small, regulated groups of craftsmen who preserved quality but restricted change. A shoemaker made shoes the same way his grandfather had. A weaver used the same loom and pattern. To innovate was to risk dishonor or accusations of greed. Stability mattered more than efficiency. In Europe, steam engines were replacing horses. In the Ottoman lands, caravans still carried goods the way they had for centuries. Ottoman cities had artisans but no factories, workers but no industrial class, merchants but little capital to invest in large-scale production. The few who attempted to modernize faced endless obstacles from both bureaucracy and tradition. The state itself discouraged competition. Industrialization thrives on private initiative, but Ottoman economic life remained tightly controlled by the government and local monopolies. Certain goods, like salt, tobacco, and textiles, could be produced or traded only with imperial permission. These monopolies generated steady tax revenue but strangled innovation. When reformers suggested importing steam engines or building textile mills, like those in Manchester, conservative officials argued that it would ruin local craftsmen and violate divine balance. In truth, they feared social change. Factories meant workers who could organize. Machines meant dependence on foreign technology. Progress meant uncertainty, something bureaucracies detest. By the early 1800s, the difference between Ottoman and European economies had become visible everywhere. In Britain, ironworks and shipyards roared day and night. In Istanbul, ships were still mostly built by hand in wooden docks. When the empire tried to compete ordering steamships or weapons from abroad, it found itself paying European suppliers rather than developing its own. The empire that once exported innovation had become its customer. The problem was not ignorance, but inertia. Reform-minded rulers saw the need for change, but every attempt clashed with a deeply rooted structure of guilds, religious authority, and privilege. Local artisans feared bankruptcy. Merchants feared competition. Clerics feared moral decay. The empire's survival instincts had turned into paralysis. Education mirrored this divide. While European schools taught mechanics, chemistry, and engineering, Ottoman madrasas still focused on theology, logic, and law. These subjects were noble but static. Few students learned geometry beyond architecture or mathematics beyond accounting. Science was seen as commentary on creation, not a tool for altering it. One of the few bright moments came during the Tanzimat reforms of the 19th century, when statesmen like Mustafa, Rizad Pasha, and Ali Pasha tried to modernize administration, education, and the economy. They introduced Western-style schools, built railways, and opened translation bureaus. But these reforms were limited and late. Industrial power can't be imported by decree. It grows from a culture that encourages invention. By the mid-19th century, European goods dominated Ottoman markets. Cotton from Egypt was shipped to Britain, turned into textiles in Manchester, and sold back to Ottoman cities at lower prices than local weavers could match. The empire became a consumer economy, buying what others made, selling what it grew. Even military modernization suffered. New rifles, artillery, and steam-powered ships were purchased from Europe rather than built domestically. The empire paid for technology with loans, plunging deeper into debt. Workshops in Istanbul and Izmir assembled parts from France and Britain, but produced little of their own. Industrialization also required coal and iron resources the Ottomans had but never fully exploited. Mines existed in Anatolia and the Balkans, yet poor infrastructure and conservative administration kept them dormant. European investors eventually extracted Ottoman resources for European factories, completing the cycle of dependence. The few factories the empire did build were mostly state-run and inefficient. Without competition, they produced at high cost and low quality. Bureaucrats managed production with more attention to paperwork than profit. When these enterprises failed, officials blamed fate, not policy. Meanwhile, the social landscape changed. In Europe, industrialization created a new middle-class businessmen, engineers, inventors. In the Ottoman Empire, the social pyramid remained rigid. Peasants, guild artisans, soldiers, and bureaucrats. There was little room for an entrepreneurial class. Wealth still flowed upward to the palace, not outward to innovation. The long-term cost of missing the Industrial Revolution was immeasurable. Europe's machines multiplied its economic and military power. The Ottomans, still running a pre-industrial economy, could no longer keep up. They fell behind not in courage or intelligence, but in tempo. The speed at which they adapted. By the time steam locomotives began crossing Anatolia in the late 19th century, most of the lines were financed, built, and owned by European companies. The empire was modernizing, but under foreign control. Railways that once could have connected provinces instead connected the empire's economy to the interests of others. This was the tragedy of Ottoman modernity. Reform without autonomy. Progress without ownership. The empire wanted to move forward, but its fear of change meant it could only borrow the future, not build it. In the end, the Industrial Revolution didn't destroy the Ottoman Empire by invasion or war. It destroyed it by while factories in Europe powered empires of their own. The once great power that had dominated 3 continents watched the world pass by its fields fertile, its cities ancient, its machines silent. By the late 18th century, the Ottoman Empire had begun to understand that it was falling behind. Defeats on the battlefield. Mounting debts, and the rapid modernization of Europe revealed what centuries of confidence had hidden. The world was changing faster than the empire could react. Yet within that slow decline emerged a small group of reformers, rulers, scholars, and administrators who tried, often alone, to drag the empire into the modern age. Their task was almost impossible. They faced not just foreign pressure, but also the resistance of their own society. The reforms they proposed threatened old privileges, traditions, and religious authorities that had defined the empire for hundreds of years. Still, they tried. One of the earliest and most determined reformers was Sultan Selim. The third reigned 1789 to 1807, educated, thoughtful, and multilingual. Selim was deeply aware of European progress. He maintained correspondence with Western diplomats and studied military manuals from France and Austria. He recognized that the empire's outdated army was its greatest weakness. Selim III launched the Nizam-wide New Order reforms, a comprehensive plan to rebuild the state. He reorganized the treasury, introduced Western-style uniforms, and established new military units. Trained by foreign officers, he even created permanent embassies in European capitals. A first for the Ottoman world, to observe and learn from foreign governments. But his reforms met fierce opposition from within. The Janissaries, jealous of their privileges, saw the new army as a direct threat. Religious conservatives accused the Sultan of betraying tradition. In 1807, a Janissary revolt erupted in Istanbul. Selim III was overthrown and later executed. His vision of renewal ended violently, but it left behind a blueprint for future generations. After Selim came Mahmud, the second reigned 1808 to 1839, who understood that the old order had to be dismantled before renewal could begin. Mahmud was cautious but decisive. In 1826, after years of preparation, he abolished the Janissary Corps during the auspicious incident, ending an institution that had defined the empire for nearly 4 centuries. The act was brutal, but necessary. Without it, no further reform would have been possible. Mahmud too introduced new ministries, modernized taxation, and established the first state postal service. He also founded schools that taught Western sciences and languages. For the first time, the Ottoman elite began to wear Western-style clothing as a symbol of change. These outward reforms could not erase centuries of inertia, but they marked the beginning of a transformation. After Mahmud's death, the reform effort entered its most ambitious stage, the Tanzimat era, 1839 to 1876. Tid means reorganization. It represented the empire's official attempt to modernize law, administration, and society along European lines. The Tanzimat began with the Hatwai Zarif of Golhain, a proclamation issued by Sultan Abdolmesadai in 1839. It promised security of life and property, fair taxation, and equality before the law for all subjects, Muslim and non-Muslim alike. For the first time, the empire declared that citizenship was based on loyalty to the state rather than religion. This was revolutionary in a multi-faith empire that had long relied on the millet system, where communities governed themselves according to faith. Behind these reforms were statesmen such as Mustafa, Razid, Ali, Pasha, and Fuad Pasha, often called the Three Pashas of Tanzimat. They were Western-educated bureaucrats who believed that survival required adaptation, not isolation. They established secular schools, translated European legal codes, and founded new ministries for education, commerce, and foreign affairs. Under their guidance, the empire introduced the Ottoman Land Code of 1858, granting formal property rights, and the Ottoman Penal Code of 1859, modeled after the French system. The government also began building telegraph lines and railways, connecting distant provinces for the first time. However, progress was uneven. The reforms depended heavily on borrowing from European banks, creating new financial dependence. Local elites resisted losing their power, and rural populations often saw reform as distant imperial interference. Corruption and inefficiency continued to undermine good intentions. In 1876, the empire adopted its first constitution, drafted under the guidance of Mithat Pasha, one of the most capable reformers of the century. It established a parliament and limited the sultan's authority, a remarkable step in a state that had long equated monarchy with divine order. But within 2 years, Sultan Abdulhamid II suspended the constitution. ruling instead through censorship and centralized control. Even so, the spirit of reform did not vanish. Throughout the late 19th century, young bureaucrats, military officers, and intellectuals continued to push for modernization. They studied in new academies, read translated European works, and corresponded with reform movements abroad. These young Ottomans, and later the Young Turks, would inherit the unfinished dream of Selim III and Mahmud II to make the empire modern before it was too late. The reformers of the Ottoman world rarely won, but they were never irrelevant. Each failed reform revealed more clearly what the empire needed and what it feared to lose. They fought not only against corruption or conservatism, but against the weight of centuries, a system built for stability, trying to move in an age of change. Their story is not one of failure alone. Many of their ideas, equality before law, secular administration, modern education, survived into the foundation of the modern Turkish Republic. Their efforts kept the empire alive longer than many predicted, buying time for transformation even as decline became inevitable. In the shadows of palaces and ministries, they carried the last spark of Ottoman curiosity, the same spirit that had once made the empire great. By the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was no longer simply fighting wars for land. It was fighting to hold itself together. For centuries, religion had been the glue that bound its vast diversity of peoples: Turks, Arabs, Greeks, Armenians, Kurds, Slavs, Albanians, and many others. Each community lived under its own leaders and laws through the millet system, loyal to the Sultan as the protector of order and faith. But as Europe modernized and the idea of the nation began to replace that of empire, this old balance began to break apart. The new danger did not come from outside, but from within. The age of nationalism had arrived. In Western Europe, philosophers and revolutionaries were redefining the idea of belonging. The French Revolution of 1789 had introduced concepts like liberty, equality, and national sovereignty. These ideas spread across the continent through books, newspapers, and soldiers. As empires fell and new nations emerged, Italy, Germany, Greece, the principle that people with a common language and culture should form their own state became an irresistible force. The Ottoman Empire, with its mosaic of ethnic and religious groups, was particularly vulnerable. For centuries, the Sultan's authority had been justified through faith as the Caliph, the protector of Islam, and the ruler over many non-Muslims who paid special taxes in exchange for security. But as the idea of national identity took hold, that arrangement began to feel outdated. Christian subjects of the empire started to see themselves not as loyal Ottomans, but as Greeks, Serbs, Bulgarians, and Romanians. The first major break came with the Greek War of Independence, 1821 to 1829. Influenced by European revolutionary ideals and supported by Western powers, Greek intellectuals and merchants led a rebellion that eventually carved out an independent state. The war shocked the Ottoman leadership, not because of the loss of territory, but because it was driven by ideas rather than armies. After Greece, nationalist movements spread across the Balkans. The Serbs won autonomy after years of uprisings. The Romanians, Bulgarians, and Montenegrins followed. Each rebellion eroded not just land, but legitimacy. The empire that once ruled 3 continents now struggled to maintain control in its European heartland. The response from Istanbul was mixed. Reformers understood that granting equal rights might slow the tide of separatism. The Tanzimat Edicts of 1839 and 1856 promised equality before the law for all citizens, regardless of religion. But in practice, old habits persisted. Local officials favored Muslims. Christian peasants distrusted reforms, and foreign powers exploited every local conflict to expand their influence. European involvement deepened the crisis. Russia claimed to protect Orthodox Christians, France supported Catholics, and Britain defended trade and balance of power. Every nationalist uprising became an opportunity for outside interference. The Ottoman Empire, once feared as a conqueror, was now treated as a problem to be managed. In the Arab provinces, a different kind of nationalism began to take root. One tied less to Europe and more to language and culture. Arab scholars in Cairo, Damascus, and Beirut began reviving Arabic literature and history, emphasizing a shared identity distinct from Ottoman Turkish rule. Though still loyal in the early 19th century, this Arab awakening would later grow into full independence movements. Nationalism also began to stir among Armenians and Kurds, though in different ways. Armenian intellectuals sought reforms and autonomy within the empire, but increasing repression and violence in the late 19th century radicalized their movement. The Kurds, divided by tribe and geography, would not unite politically until much later, but their sense of distinct identity was already forming. As nationalism spread, the Ottoman government tried to create a unifying ideology of its own. This became known as Ottomanism, the idea that all subjects, regardless of religion or ethnicity, were equal members of one imperial nation. It was a noble idea, but it faced insurmountable challenges. The empire's history had been built on religious hierarchy, not civic equality. To transform centuries of identity by decree was nearly impossible. By the mid-19th century, the empire's European provinces were in constant flux. Rebellions, reforms, and foreign interventions followed one another in rapid succession. The Crimean War, 1853-1856, in which the Ottomans fought alongside Britain and France against Russia, temporarily saved the empire from collapse, but at great financial cost. The war also confirmed a painful truth. The empire could survive only with European support. In the decades that followed, nationalism became both the empire's greatest internal challenge and its most defining force. When the Young Turk movement emerged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, its leaders initially revived Ottomanism, hoping modernization could restore unity. But after the Balkan Wars 1912 to 1913 stripped away nearly all of the empire's European territories, their focus shifted from empire to ethnicity. Turkish nationalism replaced imperial identity, a sign that even the rulers had accepted that the Ottoman system could no longer contain its diversity. The rise of nationalism did not just destroy the empire's borders, it changed its soul. The centuries-old dream of a universal, multi-ethnic Islamic state gave way to a world of nations, each speaking its own language, following its own flag, and writing its own history. By the time the First World War began, the Ottoman Empire was no longer a family of peoples bound by faith and loyalty. It was a fragile alliance of competing identities, waiting for one final shock to tear it apart. By the middle of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire had become less a global power and more a global concern. It was no longer feared as a conqueror, but studied, debated, and divided by Europe's new empires. Diplomats called it the sick man of Europe, a term first used by Tsar Nicholas of Russia in 1853, and repeated endlessly in European newspapers and political salons. The empire still controlled vast lands, but its independence had become conditional, its future a subject of negotiation among stronger nations. The European powers, Britain, France, Russia, and later Austria and Germany, each saw opportunity in the empire's weakness. They competed to influence its government, control its trade, and claim pieces of its territory without openly destroying it. The Ottoman world became a chessboard of imperial diplomacy, with its provinces used as bargaining pieces. Russia had the most direct ambitions. For centuries, it had sought warm water ports and access to the Mediterranean. The decline of Ottoman military strength made the dream of seizing Constantinople, which Russians called Tsargrad, seem attainable. Under the banner of protecting Orthodox Christians in the Balkans, Russia intervened repeatedly in wars, rebellions, and protectorate treaties that extended its influence deep into Ottoman territory. Britain and France opposed Russian expansion, but not out of sympathy for the Ottomans. They viewed the empire as a buffer state, a necessary barrier between Europe and the growing power of the Russian Empire. British strategists feared that if Russia controlled the Bosporus and the Dardanelles, it could threaten Britain's sea route to India. French leaders, meanwhile, sought to preserve influence in the eastern Mediterranean through missionary schools, consulates, and commercial privileges. This uneasy balance led to one of the most paradoxical episodes in Ottoman history. The Crimean War, 1853 to 1856. Britain and France, long rivals of the Ottomans, suddenly became their allies against Russia. European soldiers fought under the Ottoman banner, defending the very empire their governments described as doomed. The war ended in Ottoman victory, or rather, in temporary survival. The Treaty of Paris, 1856, guaranteed the empire's territorial integrity and admitted it. Symbolically, into the concert of Europe, the alliance of major powers that maintained continental balance. But the price of that protection was dependency. The empire's military success in Crimea came at enormous financial cost. To pay for weapons, railways, and modernization projects, the government borrowed heavily from European banks. By the 1870s, Ottoman debt had reached unmanageable levels. Interest payments consumed nearly half of state revenue. In 1881, the empire was forced to create the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, a European-run body that directly collected taxes from several provinces to repay foreign creditors. This effectively placed parts of the Ottoman economy under foreign control. Humiliating but unavoidable concession. Economic dependence soon translated into political pressure. Britain occupied Egypt in 1882, claiming to protect the Suez Canal, but in reality, taking control of the empire's most valuable province. France extended its influence over Tunisia in 1881, and Italy seized Libya in 1911. Each conquest was justified as stabilization, but together they carved away the empire's richest territories. At the same time, Germany emerged as a new ally. The German Empire, under Kaiser Wilhelm II, saw the Ottomans as a strategic partner against Britain and Russia. German engineers built railways, including the famous Berlin-Baghdad Railway, designed to connect Europe directly with the Persian Gulf. German officers trained Ottoman soldiers, supplied weapons, and reshaped parts of the military. To the Ottomans, Germany seemed different, less interested in colonization, more in partnership. But this alliance also came with risk. By tying its fortunes to one European power, the empire alienated others. The once independent sultans now balanced diplomacy like acrobats. Each treaty a survival act between competing giants. The empire's internal politics reflected this constant pressure. Reformers saw European institutions as models. Conservatives saw them as threats. The Tanzimat reforms had promised modernization. But the growing influence of foreign advisors created resentment among officials who felt their sovereignty slipping away. In the streets of Istanbul, European banks, shipping companies, and newspapers flourished, symbols of progress to some, of foreign domination to others. This new reality made the empire both globalized and powerless. Telegraph lines, railways, and steamships connected it to the world. Yet those same systems deepened its dependence. Factories were built with foreign capital. Schools were staffed by foreign missionaries. Even modernization became a form of control. In the Balkans, nationalism continued to spread under the protective gaze of Russia and Austria. Every rebellion risked European intervention. In the Middle East, Britain and France expanded their economic footholds through loans and trade concessions. The empire could not act without consulting the powers that surrounded it. By the end of the 19th century, the Ottoman world had become a protectorate in all but name. Its rulers still issued decrees, its soldiers still paraded, and its coins still bore the Sultan's tagra. But real authority was the decisions that shaped the empire's fate were increasingly made in London, Paris, Berlin, and St. Petersburg. Still, the empire endured, not through strength, but through necessity. Europe preferred a weak Ottoman state to a chaotic vacuum. As long as it existed, the balance of power remained intact. That artificial survival, however, could not last forever. By the early 20th century, the same network of alliances that had kept the empire alive was drawing it toward disaster. When tensions in Europe finally exploded into war in 1914, the Ottoman Empire would face its final and most fateful choice, one that would determine whether it died quietly or went down in flames. In the summer of 1914, Europe caught fire. One by one, the great powers mobilized: Austria-Hungary against Serbia, Russia against Austria, Germany against France and Britain. The Ottoman Empire, weakened and cautious, watched from the sidelines. For centuries, it had survived by balancing European powers against one another. Now, with the world divided into armed camps, neutrality was a fragile illusion. Inside the empire, debate raged. Some ministers argued that staying neutral was the only path to survival. Others believed that aligning with one side could restore lost power. The empire's leaders were deeply divided, but one faction, young, ambitious, and convinced that destiny still favored them, made a choice that would change history. That faction was led by the Committee of Union and Progress CO, better known as the Young Turks. After deposing Sultan Abdulhamid II in Ijolingjo, they had effectively taken control of the government. Their leaders, Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Simil Pasha dreamed of rejuvenating the empire through nationalism and military strength. They believed a bold alliance could restore Ottoman pride and territory lost in the Balkan Wars. Germany saw opportunity. Kaiser Wilhelm II and his generals viewed the Ottoman Empire as a valuable partner, a way to open a new front against Britain and Russia, and to spread unrest in colonial regions with Muslim populations. German military missions had already been training the Ottoman army for years. Railways, armaments, and advisors flowed in. In August 1914, as Europe descended into chaos, the Ottomans signed a secret alliance with Germany. The terms were simple. If the empire entered the war on Germany's side, it would receive military support and the promise of protection against its enemies. The deal was risky, but the cup leaders believed it might save the empire from irrelevance. At first, the empire remained officially neutral. Its army was still recovering from defeats in the Balkan Wars, 1912-1913, which had cost nearly all of its European territory. The navy was outdated, the treasury nearly empty. Yet, on October 29, 1914, two German warships under Ottoman flag, the Goban and the Breslau, launched a surprise attack on Russian ports in the Black Sea. The act, coordinated by Enver Pasha, forced the issue. Russia declared war within days. Britain and France followed. The empire was now part of the Central Powers. The decision was final. The early months of war brought both hope and disaster. The Ottomans declared a jihad, a holy war against the Allied powers, calling on Muslims worldwide to rise against colonial rulers. The call had limited effect outside the empire, but it stirred enthusiasm at home. The government believed the war could spark a pan-Islamic revival, uniting Arabs, Turks, and Persians under Ottoman leadership. Instead, the war exposed how divided and exhausted the empire truly was. It fought on multiple fronts at once: the Caucasus against Russia, Mesopotamia against Britain, the Suez Canal against Egypt, and later Palestine and Arabia. Supply lines were weak, coordination poor, and soldiers elite. One of the first major disasters came in the Caucasus campaign. Enver Pasha personally led troops into the mountains during the harsh winter of 1914, hoping to strike a quick victory against Russia. It ended in catastrophe. Tens of thousands of Ottoman soldiers froze or starved to death in the snow. The defeat crippled morale and exposed Enver's recklessness. Farther south, the empire faced new threats. In 1915, British and Anzac forces landed at Gallipoli, hoping to capture Istanbul through the dark. The Ottomans, under commanders like Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, repelled the invasion after months of brutal fighting. Gallipoli became one of the few Ottoman victories of the war, a symbol of courage and resilience amid widespread loss. But elsewhere, the situation worsened. In Mesopotamia, British forces captured Baghdad in 1917. In Palestine, General Allenby's army advanced through Gaza and entered Jerusalem. In Arabia, British agents, most famously T.E. Lawrence, encouraged Arab tribes to revolt against Ottoman rule, promising independence after the war. The empire's own subjects were now fighting against it. The strain of total war pushed the empire to the breaking point. Food shortages spread, infrastructure collapsed, and disease followed. The government resorted to censorship and conscription, deepening resentment in the chaos. Tragedy struck the empire's Armenian population. In 1915, under suspicion of collaboration with Russia, hundreds of thousands of Armenians were deported from Anatolia. The mass deaths that followed remain one of the darkest and most disputed chapters in Ottoman history. By 1917, the alliance with Germany was clearly failing. The Central Powers were losing on every front, and the Ottoman army was stretched beyond recovery. Yet its leaders refused to surrender, hoping that one more offensive might reverse the tide. It never did. In October 1918, After 4 years of war, the empire signed the Armistice of Mudros. Ending its participation in World War I, its army was disbanded, its fleet surrendered, and its territories occupied by Allied forces. The war had cost the empire everything: its provinces, its economy, and its sovereignty. The dream of revival had turned into catastrophe. The decision to join the war, meant to save the Ottoman world from collapse, had accelerated its end. Within a few years, the once mighty empire that had ruled from Budapest to Mecca would cease to exist. When the guns of World War I finally fell silent in 1918, the Ottoman Empire no longer resembled the state that had entered the war 4 years earlier. Its armies were shattered, its cities occupied, its people exhausted. The dream of restoring glory through alliance with Germany had ended not in victory, but in dismantlement. After 6 centuries, the empire that had once stood at the center of 3 continents was finished. The Armistice of Mudros, signed on October 30th, 1918, effectively ended Ottoman sovereignty. It allowed Allied forces to occupy key strategic points, including the Dardanelles, Bosporus, and Istanbul itself. Ottoman ships were disarmed, troops demobilized, and communication lines placed under foreign control. The empire still existed on paper, but in practice, it was now governed by the victors of the war. British, French, Italian, and Greek troops entered the capital in November 1918. For the first time since its conquest in 1453, Constantinople fell under foreign occupation. Allied warships anchored in the Bosporus, their flags visible from the domes of Hagia, Sophia, and Topkapi Palace, a sight that symbolized the complete humiliation of Ottoman power. The empire's leadership was in chaos. The triumvirate of Enver Talat and Simul Pasha, who'd led the empire into war, fled the country. In 1919, a court-martial in Istanbul sentenced them to death in absentia. Public anger turned toward the Committee of Union and Progress, blamed for the disaster. The government that had promised salvation had delivered dismemberment across the provinces. Occupation and rebellion followed. Britain seized Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, and Palestine. France took control of Syria and Lebanon. Greece, encouraged by Allied support, landed troops in Smyrna Izamur in 1919, aiming to annex western Anatolia. Italy occupied parts of the southern coast. Even the Ottoman heartland was no longer safe. In 1920, the Allies drafted the Treaty of Sevres, which formalized the empire's partition. It stripped the Ottomans of nearly all their territories outside Anatolia. The Arab lands were divided into mandates under British and French control. Armenia and Kurdistan were promised independence. The Straits were placed under international supervision. The empire's capital was reduced to Istanbul and a small surrounding area. For the first time in centuries, the Ottoman state faced total erasure. The Sultan at the time, Mehmed VI Vahideddin, accepted the terms reluctantly, believing that compliance might preserve what little remained of his throne. But to many in Anatolia, surrender was betrayal. Among the officers and soldiers who had survived the war, a new movement began to form, one that refused to let the empire's core die quietly. That movement centered around Mustafa Kemal, a general who had gained fame at Gallipoli. In 1919, he arrived in the city of Samsun on the Black Sea coast, declaring that the Turkish homeland was under occupation and that resistance was a national duty. His call spread quickly. Across Anatolia, local militias and nationalist committees united under his leadership, forming what would soon become the Turkish national movement. While the Sultan cooperated with the Allies in Istanbul, Kemal and his followers convened a new Grand National Assembly in Ankara in 1920, declaring themselves the legitimate representatives of the nation. 2 governments now claimed to rule the same land, one imperial, one revolutionary. The following years brought civil war and foreign intervention. Greek forces advanced deep into Anatolia, capturing major cities, including Eskişehir and Ayaf. In 1921, they approached Ankara itself. But under Kemal's command, the nationalists launched a counteroffensive, culminating in the Battle of Sakarya, which turned the tide. By 1922, the Greek army was in full retreat, and Smyrna was recaptured. That victory changed everything. With the nationalists in control, The Allied powers realized that the old Ottoman regime could no longer enforce their treaty. Negotiations reopened, leading to the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, which recognized the sovereignty of the Republic of Turkey and the end of foreign occupation. On November 1st, 1922, the Ottoman Sultanate was formally abolished. Mehmed VI fled aboard a British warship, and in over 600 years of imperial rule. The Caliphate lingered briefly under Abdülmecid II, but it too was dissolved in 1924. The Ottoman Empire, which had once ruled the Middle East, North Africa, and southeastern Europe, now existed only in memory. The collapse of the empire marked more than the death of a state. It was the closing of an age. It ended the medieval Islamic world order that had dominated Eurasia for centuries. In its place emerged a modern, secular republic that looked westward for inspiration. The transformation was total. New alphabet, new laws, new education system, and even a new calendar. For the millions who had lived under Ottoman rule, the collapse was both loss and liberation. Arab provinces found themselves under European mandates. Balkan nations were already independent. Turks began to rebuild from ruins. The empire that had once united so many peoples now scattered them into new nations, each rewriting its past. The fall of the Ottoman Empire was not a single event, but a long process. Centuries of hesitation, decades of reform, and finally, for catastrophic years of war. It was undone less by enemies than by exhaustion, political, economic, and intellectual. The world had entered a new age, and the empire had remained too long in the old one. The end came not with conquest, but with surrender to inevitability. When the Ottoman Empire vanished from the map, many expected Anatolia to dissolve with it. After all, its economy was broken, its cities damaged, and its population divided between refugees, veterans, and the displaced. Yet out of that wreckage rose a new state, one built not on dynasty, but on citizenship, not on faith, but on law. The Republic of Turkey, proclaimed in 1923, was both the heir and the rejection of the empire that had preceded it. The man who led this transformation was Mustafa Kemal, soon to be known as Atatürk, meaning father of the Turks. A career officer educated in the Ottoman military academies, he had witnessed firsthand the empire's decline, from the incompetence of palace politics to the chaos of the First World War. He understood that mere reform would never save a structure as old and brittle as the Ottoman state. It had to be replaced entirely. The Treaty of Lausanne, signed in July 1923, confirmed the sovereignty of the new republic and defined its borders, roughly those of modern Turkey. For the first time in centuries, the Turks ruled a state composed mainly of their own ethnic group, free of European occupation or direct control. The capital moved from imperial Istanbul to inland Ankara, a deliberate break from the past. It was symbolic. Power would no longer rest on palaces and tradition, but on administration and renewal. Atatürk's task was enormous. The Ottoman inheritance included a mostly illiterate population, a devastated economy, and institutions tied to religion. Yet his vision was clear: to transform the remains of empire into a modern nation-state modeled on Europe, but rooted in Turkish identity. The first step was political. On October 29, 1923, the Republic of Turkey was officially proclaimed, and Mustafa Kemal became its first president. Within months, the government abolished the Caliphate, 1924, ending the centuries-old link between political authority and religious leadership. Religious courts and schools were replaced by a unified, secular, legal, and educational system. The Arabic script, which had defined Ottoman Turkish, was replaced with a new Latin alphabet in 1928 to improve literacy and align with Western Europe. Economic recovery followed the same principle of independence. Foreign concessions and debt structures inherited from the Ottoman era were renegotiated or cancelled. The new government launched industrial projects, encouraged domestic manufacturing, and built railways, connecting inland regions long neglected under the empire. State-led development became a hallmark of early Republican policy. Socially, the transformation was even deeper. Atatürk and his circle introduced civil reforms that redefined daily life. The 1926 Turkish Civil Code, modeled on the Swiss system, granted women equal rights in marriage, divorce, and inheritance. Polygamy, was banned. In 1934, women received the right to vote and to hold office decades before many European nations did the same. Religion remained part of society, but was separated from government. The Directorate of Religious Affairs Diyanet replaced the Ottoman religious establishment, ensuring that Islam remained under state supervision but without political power. Mosques continued to operate, but sermons emphasized unity and national progress rather than empire. Education became the core of modernization. New secular schools opened across the country, replacing the old. Teachers trained in new institutions spread literacy to the countryside. In the 1920s, only about 10% of Turks could read. Within a generation, that number multiplied several times. The goal was to create not subjects of a sultan, but citizens of a republic, people who could read laws, newspapers, and the constitution in their own language. Culturally, Ataturk sought to redefine identity itself. The Ottoman Empire had been multi-ethnic and multilingual, but the republic promoted Turkish nationalism as a unifying force. The government established language and history institutes to research and standardize pure Turkish vocabulary, removing many Arabic and Persian loanwords. Public buildings displayed slogans like "Sovereignty belongs unconditionally to the nation." The arts, too, became tools of transformation. Western-style painting, music, and theater were encouraged. Classical European compositions were taught alongside Turkish folk traditions. The fez, the iconic Ottoman headgear, was banned in favor of Western-style hats, a small change that symbolized a massive shift in mentality. Not everyone accepted these reforms easily. Conservative religious groups opposed the abolition of the caliphate, while some rural areas resisted the pace of cultural change. Yet the republic's leadership moved decisively, using law and education rather than force whenever possible. The result was a state that, within 2 decades, had turned from a defeated empire into a functioning modern nation. The transformation also reshaped the country's foreign relations. Ataturk pursued a policy of neutrality and peace, summarized in his famous phrase, "Peace at home, peace in the world." He avoided entanglement in European conflicts and focused instead on internal consolidation. Turkey joined the League of Nations in 1932, gaining recognition as a stable, sovereign power. By the time of Ataturk's death in 1938, Turkey had changed beyond recognition. The empire of palaces, janissaries, and religious hierarchy had been replaced by a republic of schools, factories, and civic institutions. The Ottoman coat of arms had given way to the simple red flag, with a white crescent and star, ancient symbols, given new meaning. The birth of modern Turkey was not merely a political transition. It was a civilizational shift, from rule by dynasty to rule by citizens, from faith as law to law as faith. It marked the survival of the Ottoman legacy in a new form, no longer as an empire of subjects, but as a nation of equals. In this way, the Ottoman story did not end. It evolved. The state that once ruled half the known world had died, but from its ashes rose one that would endure through the storms of the 20th century. Smaller, poorer, but alive, determined, and independent. When the Ottoman Empire finally vanished, it left behind not just ruins and archives, but lessons, some of power, others of failure. Few civilizations lasted as long, ruled as many peoples, or influenced as much of the world. Yet its fall was not sudden. It was a slow unraveling of habits, beliefs, and missed opportunities. For historians and nations alike, the Ottoman story remains one of the clearest mirrors of how empires rise, sustain themselves, and quietly decline. The first and most enduring lesson is that adaptation is survival. The Ottomans built their greatness on flexibility. In the early centuries, they absorbed what worked from others. Persian administration, Byzantine architecture, Arab scholarship, and European technology. They borrowed, experimented, and blended cultures. But when that openness hardened into pride, the empire's golden age began to fade. The refusal to modernize in science, education, and economics became the slow poison that weakened its body from within. Empires fall not only to invasion, but to stagnation. The printing ban, the resistance to industrialization, and the dominance of the janissaries all came from the same impulse, the desire to preserve order by preventing change. The Ottomans confused stability with strength. In doing so, they protected the past so tightly that they strangled the future. The second lesson is about power and diversity. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire governed millions of people of different faiths and languages with relative peace. Its millet system, allowing communities to manage their own affairs, created a kind of multicultural coexistence rare in medieval or early modern states. But that same structure, when challenged by modern nationalism, proved fragile. A system built on separation could not survive in an age demanding equality. When nationalism spread through the empire's provinces, the Ottomans tried to respond with Ottomanism, the idea that everyone could belong equally under one flag. The ideal was admirable, but it arrived too late. Empires can tolerate diversity when they are strong. They cannot rebuild unity after trust has broken. The third lesson lies in the balance between faith and reason. The Ottomans saw no contradiction between religion and governance for centuries. Islam was their moral compass and their source of legitimacy. Yet as Europe secularized and turned to science, the empire hesitated. The fear that modern knowledge might erode, faith kept its schools, courts, and universities frozen in time. The result was not the protection of belief, but the loss of competitiveness. History shows that civilizations collapse not because they are religious or secular, but because they fail to reconcile the two. The Ottomans never found that balance in their later years. Another crucial lesson is the danger of overreach. The empire expanded so far that its resources could no longer match its size. Managing distant provinces like Yemen, Algeria, or Hungary demanded immense manpower and money. By the 17th century, the empire was defending borders longer than its economy could sustain. When global trade shifted away from the Mediterranean, it lacked both the navy and the industry to compensate. Expansion had once made it powerful. Now, it made it fragile. There is also a lesson in bureaucracy and reform. The Ottoman administrative system was one of the most sophisticated in the pre-modern world. It kept order across vast territories for centuries. But the same bureaucracy that had once been its strength became its cage. Officials prized procedure over innovation, and every attempt at reform met layers of resistance. A state designed to maintain equilibrium cannot easily reinvent itself. The later reformers, from Selim III to the Tanzimat statesmen, understood what had to change. The army, the schools, the laws. But even their best efforts were slowed by entrenched interests and conservative opposition. The lesson is simple. The longer a system resists change, the harder change becomes. The empire's decline also reveals much about foreign influence. European powers did not destroy the Ottoman state outright. They absorbed it gradually through loans, trade privileges, and diplomacy. The empire's dependence on foreign credit in the 19th century mirrored a global pattern that would repeat across the colonial world. Economic control often precedes political domination. The Ottomans became one of history's first examples of a great power undone not by conquest, but by debt. Even its final fall offers a paradoxical lesson in renewal. The Ottoman collapse allowed something new to emerge. A modern Turkish nation that embraced science, secularism, and education. The transition was painful, but it preserved continuity in another form. Civilizations do not always die. Sometimes they evolve under new names. For the Arab world, the Balkans, and even parts of Europe, Ottoman rule left deep marks in law, architecture, cuisine, and culture. Cities like Sarajevo, Cairo, and Thessaloniki still bear traces of that era in their streets and skylines. The empire's history became a shared heritage, both admired and resented. In the end, the Ottomans remind us that no empire, however vast, can defy time. Wealth, armies, and faith may sustain power for centuries, but without curiosity, the will to learn and adapt, even the greatest structures hollow from within. Their story is not a tragedy alone. It is also a warning and a lesson that the strength of a civilization lies not in what it builds, but in whether it continues to question itself. The Ottomans once did, and they rose. They stopped, and they fell. The echo of that truth remains as relevant now as it was 100 years ago. The Ottoman Empire may have ended a century ago, but its presence still lingers. Not just in the ruins of mosques and fortresses, but in languages, laws, cuisines, and habits scattered across 3 continents. Its borders may have vanished, yet the traces of its rule still shape how nations live, trade, and even dream. The empire that once unified so many peoples under one banner continues to cast a long shadow over history. Walk through Istanbul today, and you can still feel it. The call to prayer rises from the same minarets that pierced the skyline 500 years ago. The domes of Soleimani and Hagia Sophia still dominate the horizon, symbols of an empire that fused art and authority into one expression. Beneath those domes lie the tombs of sultans, scholars, and architects, silent reminders of a civilization that once defined the very idea of order. Across the Balkans, the Middle East, and North Africa, Ottoman influence endures in quieter ways. In Sarajevo, old mosques stand beside Orthodox churches and Catholic cathedrals, a reflection of the empire's old mosaic of coexistence. In Cairo, narrow alleys, built by Ottoman governors, still lead to markets that sell spices, once traded through imperial caravans. In Jerusalem, Ottoman walls still encircle the old city, built under Suleiman the Magnificent. Even in Athens, Belgrade, and Skopje, Fantuse, bridges and hammams, built under Ottoman rule, remain part of the landscape. The empire's imprint also lives in culture. Words of Turkish origin appear in Arabic, Greek, Serbian, Albanian, and Bosnian. Coffee culture, the ritual of brewing, sharing, and debating over small cups, spread from Yemen through the Ottoman world and eventually to Europe. Even bureaucratic traditions, from land registries to military organization, trace their roots to Ottoman administration. Modern nation-states that once formed parts of the empire still wrestle with its legacy. For some, it is a memory of oppression. For others, a reminder of stability and cosmopolitanism. In the Arab world, Ottoman rule is often remembered through the prism of decline and foreign domination. In the Balkans, it evokes centuries of coexistence and tension. In Turkey, it remains both a source of pride and caution, a golden age to be admired, but not repeated. The empire's fall also reshaped global politics. Its collapse after World War I redrew the map of the Middle East. New borders drawn by European diplomats at tables in Paris and London ignored centuries of Ottoman administrative boundaries. The consequences still echo today in regional disputes and fragile states. Few empires in history left behind such a complex inheritance, both unifying traditions and unresolved divisions. Culturally, the Ottoman synthesis remains unique. It blended Islamic principles with administrative rationality, Persian aesthetics with Byzantine architecture, Arab scholarship with Turkic discipline. Its art valued symmetry. Its government prized hierarchy. It created a world that believed in divine order reflected in human design. The result was neither purely Eastern nor Western. It was something entirely its own. Yet the empire's true legacy is not in what it built, but in what it attempted to govern diversity on an imperial scale. For 6 centuries, it maintained relative peace among peoples of different religions and languages under a single system. That experiment, however imperfect, demonstrated that coexistence was possible long before the modern idea of multiculturalism existed. The Ottoman model eventually broke under the pressures of modernity, nationalism, industrialization, and colonial competition. But its central idea, that many identities could live under one law, remains one of its most remarkable achievements. In an age when nations still struggle with diversity, that legacy continues to resonate. Even the republic that replaced the empire carries echoes of its methods. Turkish bureaucracy, urban planning, and diplomacy all evolved from Ottoman frameworks. The foreign policy of zero problems with neighbors, pursued centuries later, still reflects the old imperial instinct for balance and pragmatism. Time has softened the empire's image. Once feared as a conqueror and scorned as a sick man, it is now studied as a civilization complex, adaptable, flawed, and magnificent. The same world that once fought against it now preserves its heritage as a part of shared history. The Ottoman Empire's power no longer exists, but its rhythm survives in the sound of a call to prayer, in the pattern of a carpet, in the names of streets and dishes across the former empire's lands. Its fall reminds the world that every civilization, no matter how vast, eventually becomes memory. Yet some memories never fade. The Ottomans taught the world how to govern an empire, and by their end, how easily such empires can crumble. They built for eternity, and though eternity eluded them, their story endures, carved into stone, written in law, and whispered in the languages of millions who live where their banners once flew. In Sensei, the empire never truly disappeared. It became a soft, but unending, a reminder that power fades, but influence lingers. History quiets here. The great walls, the domes, the voices of sultans and soldiers, all of them fade into silence. What remains is the soft rhythm of time itself, the slow breathing of a civilization that once ruled the crossroads of the world and then simply stopped. Imagine the streets of Istanbul at dusk. The air is warm and carries the faint smell of sea salt and roasted chestnuts. The Bosphorus glimmers under a fading sun, and the call to prayer drifts through the mist, not as command, but as memory. Stone bridges and tiled courtyards hold the weight of centuries, yet now they rest in quiet peace. The empire that once commanded continents is gone, but its pulse lingers in small, human ways. In the laughter of cafe guests sipping coffee from porcelain cups, in the pattern of shadows falling across marble floors, in the calligraphy carved above an old wooden door. The echoes of its languages still murmur through markets, and its laws still shape nations far beyond its borders. Empires fall. Memory endures. What was once a world of swords and banners is now one of books, museums, and families tracing their roots to a name, a place. A story that began long ago. The Ottomans are not gone. They are simply folded into the rhythm of modern life, like old music woven into a new song. Let that thought settle for a moment, that even power, when it fades, leaves something gentle behind. The marble cools, the water stills, and the centuries breathe out in relief. What was once empire is now So, close your eyes. The domes dim. The sea whispers, and history rests, not in triumph or tragedy, but in peace.